All right, listeners, time for the first segment of our very special show here at Busan Worldwide in light of Canada Day. We have our special interview. And in light of today, once again being Canada Day, we have someone very special with us who's most fitting for this very special day.
Right. So our special guest is an ambassador who seems to have an overflowing love for our city of Busan, working hard to solidify and build upon the relationship between Canada and Korea. Please welcome Michael Danagher, Canadian Ambassador to Korea.
Welcome to our show.
Welcome.
Well, thank you both. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah.
It's an honor to have you as our guest. So could you maybe directly say hello and introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
My pleasure. Well, I'd like to greet all the listeners of BFM and all the people in Busan and the region. And I come here quite often. I may have met many of you over the years.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite destinations in Korea. I have to say that with great honesty.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
How often do you visit our city?
Well, I'm here now in my third assignment to Korea. So my total time that I've spent with my family in Korea is over 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
So over that 10 years, based in Seoul all throughout that time, I am estimating that I've been to Busan anywhere from 40 to 50 times.
Oh, wow.
Do you remember the first year you
Yes, I
visited
do.
our city?
How
long ago was that?
It was in 1992. It was in April 1992.
April of 1992.
With my wife very much expecting our first two children, our twins.
Really?
So they were they visited Busan before they visited anywhere in the world in a way. And we stayed at the am I allowed to say the hotel?
Sure.
The Chosun Hotel, and we walked down Haeundae, and we excited a lot of people because I guess there were not so many foreigners back then, and they thought we were very interesting, and we attracted a lot of interest.
I see. So since then, 1992, almost 3 decades have passed since your first visit to our city, and in between, you mentioned 40 to 50 times coming down to Busan. How much, in your eyes, has our city changed compared to the first time you visited?
Well, Haeundae in particular is unrecognizable. And when we came back here in 2009, which was our time of our second assignment, everything had just grown upwards.
Right.
And when I came here, when I was here in the 90s, for example, we had a Canadian ships visit. It must have been about 1994. And we invited all the Canadians that we knew of that were living in Busan to visit the naval ship. And I think there was only about 6 or 7.
Oh.
Okay.
Now we have a consulate in Busan,
Right.
and we estimate there's approximately 2,000 Canadians living in Busan and Gyeongsangnam-do. So things have changed.
Yeah,
We have a
for
large
sure.
Canadian community here.
A couple of them here at our radio station as well.
I understand, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, for this time around, what brings you here?
Well, it's what I would call a regular parish visit. It's part of Korea, and I'm assigned to Korea, not just to Seoul. So I
Right.
do like to visit outside of the capital and maintain contact with all the cities and all of the officials, and certainly with our Canadian population. So I haven't really been able to get to Busan because of the pandemic primarily. We were very cautious in terms of imposing ourselves as visitors to different parts, but we see that there's a number of events, international events that are happening, so we're visiting there. Now, my purpose, I've been here since Sunday, and we've had a number of different calls. I went to Gojedo for the first time yesterday.
How was that?
It was interesting. I'm a big buff of history, and I think this was a bit of an unknown chapter for Canadian the Canadian military, the prisoner of war camp, and the role that Canadian troops had there. And I found out a few interesting facts about connections between Canada and the camp. But had a number of other meetings yesterday in Busan. And today I was at the UN cemetery. We have, of course, 380 Canadians who fell in the Korean War.
Right.
Who are
And
buried
residing
there.
in our city of Busan, yes.
That's right. And we also were at the Peace Museum. I donated some books there.
Wow.
So it's really an opportunity to commemorate the connections between Canada and Busan. Of course, this is where the Canadians, most of them, I believe, who participated in the Korean War would have arrived. This
Yeah.
was the first port of call.
Yeah.
And so there's a long tradition. And last year in February, I was here to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the opening of the consulate, which was very important to me because I was here 25 years ago. So it was like Michael J. Fox, which is another Canadian connection. It was Back to the Future, right?
Yeah.
And it was great to be back for that occasion. And I mentioned in my speech that Professor Gale, who was one of the early Canadian missionaries here, in his book about his time in Korea, he mentions his first visit was to Busan in 1892. So I'd like to say there's been a Canadian somewhere in Korea since at least 1892, and maybe continually since that time.
Yeah. I personally didn't know that it goes all the way back to 1892. Wow.
Continuing on, once again, we have Mr. Michael Danagher, Canadian ambassador to Korea, with us here in the studio in light of the Canada Day special here on Busan Worldwide. Now, you mentioned you're a bit of a history buff.
That's right.
And you mentioned Canadian soldiers being a part of the Korean War. And the soldiers were actually directly involved in a battle called the Battle of Pyongyang. So could you tell maybe our listeners a bit about your knowledge on that battle?
Well, indeed, that's one of the things we're celebrating this year. Our celebration is maybe the wrong word, commemoration.
Sure.
It's the 70th anniversary. And in my opinion, it's one of the major battles of Canadian military history. And certainly it's the best known battle in the Korean War in which Canadian troops were involved. So Gapyeong is up on the river of the same name, up in the border between Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do.
Right.
And it was an important, how would you say, part of the defensive line when there was the assault from the Chinese divisions back in 1951, that northern offensive. And Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, UK, and US troops were in that position. The Canadian troops were up on the height of what was called Hill 655, or I think it was still... am I right? Hill 677. But it was a tall hill up there.
Sure.
And they were essentially the only troops in the way of the Chinese, an entire division attack against the positions. So it was 600 against approximately 10,000. And whatever they did, in the morning, the assault, they retreated. And it was left in possession of the Canadians. So it's almost like the movie 300, right?
Yeah.
The Spartans at Thermopylae, and so it's a fascinating story, and there's only a very few survivors of that battle left in Canada, unfortunately. But I think this is one that we would like to have remembered here in Korea.
Right.
Wow.
And since then, 70 years has passed, right? So what kind of memorial events or ceremonies are prepared for these veterans?
Good question. Well, we've been, of course, every year since the Korean War, the Korean government has been very generous in supporting visits back to Korea of veterans from Canada and from the other countries that sent their troops. And we really went to... we really like to see them. Hill 677.
Okay.
That's what it was.
We really value those visits. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, it's not a good idea to have these very old, very elderly veterans come here.
Right.
We hope we can resume those visits soon. But in lieu of that, we planned a number of events. We started with photo exhibits, for example. Of the participation of Canada. We have held one at the War Memorial in Seoul. We're going to open up in the Pyeongtaek, city of Pyeongtaek this week, and eventually we'll come down to Busan at the Peace Museum here. And that's just one way of remembering those events. And as part of that, we've produced a book commemorating as well, that experience, and having some personal accounts from some of those veterans.
Yeah.
And apart from that, I'm launching at the UN Cemetery a little bit of a social media campaign.
Oh, okay.
I found out that there was one Canadian soldier who was buried there that went to my high school.
Oh,
Really?
wow.
He was the only student from my high school who died in the war.
An alumni from the high school that you
Alumni.
attended.
So I went to see
Fought in the
him,
Korean
alumni
War.
to alumni.
Wow.
Whenever I come to the cemetery, I make a point of trying to pass by each grave of each Canadian there, but this one called for special attention. And I guess my invitation is, if you're a Canadian, you're living in Korea, hopefully your listeners are among that group, and you wish to visit a Canadian you can find a connection with. Perhaps it's your hometown, perhaps you went to the same school as them. It's a personal connection.
Yeah.
There are 30,000 Canadians living in Korea. And I think that's a small city. And I think we should be able to find some connections. And if they do, the cemetery have promised they'll take good care of you. And we'd like each visitor, of course, to have a memento of that. So we'll be providing a copy of this book that I mentioned about Pyongyang for each person who does that, and puts it on their social media so that it builds awareness. And so are the families of those fallen Canadians back home in Canada who can't visit. At least they know somebody is here and showing concern and visiting their fallen family members and friends.
Yeah. To see that kind of connection, you mentioned an alumni of your high school being a part of the Korean War, it really brings it close to home, close to heart, that this connection that Korea has with your country of Canada.
Right.
Now, as you mentioned, a number of these fallen soldiers and veterans actually residing here in our city of Busan at the UN Peace Memorial Park, and more surviving Canadian veterans actually saying that if when their time is up, they want to be buried here alongside their the fellow soldiers. What do you think the reason is for them wanting to be spend the rest of their worldly time here in our city of Busan?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, the answers are as individual as the persons themselves. We've had a few, as you say, who passed away in Canada and have been reburied. I happened to be present at the ceremony a couple of years ago when one of them, Corporal McBride, was interred here. And I can only imagine that perhaps at the end of the years they look back on their lives and they say this was one of the greatest things that they did or that they accomplished in their life, was to have fought for the cause of freedom and for the Korean people, and to see what a great country has been built essentially on the sacrifices of few, and not just the UN sending states, but the soldiers of the Republic of Korea as well.
Yeah.
So I can fully understand that spirit.
It's just that mindset, obviously, and the brotherhood that continues on with these soldiers, surviving soldiers and the fallen soldiers, to be buried alongside with the people that they had really put their lives on the line for each other. That's probably also the mindset that a lot of these veterans have, wanting to be buried here in our city, Busan, at the UN Peace Memorial Park.
Right. All right, let's talk about your visits around the city here in Busan. You did mention that you visited the Korea Maritime Institute last week. So can you tell us about your visit?
Absolutely. Well, the Korea Maritime Institute is one of the best of its kind in the world, in my opinion. And every year they host the Arctic Week here in Busan. And of course, Canada is an Arctic country. We're one of the 7 member nations of the Arctic Council.
Right.
And Korea is an observer country, and KMI, along with a number of other institutions around Korea, play a very strong role in Arctic and Antarctic research. So the purpose of our visit is really to discuss where we can move, and KMI always has wonderful ideas about their research, and my role is really to facilitate that partnership from a Canadian perspective.
Right.
And again, I think our assessment of Korea's participation on Arctic issues it's been very, very much one of commitment and one of bringing value to the relationship. So I'm very happy to continue that connection.
Yeah, very encouraging to see this type of cooperation taking place between the two countries. Speaking of cooperation and relationship, our city of Busan and Montreal in Canada happen to be sister cities. Tell our listeners what kind of exchanges are taking place between the two.
Well, the two cities have a lot of different, a long history, and I know in the past they've been focusing on culture. They've been focusing the film sector, for example, fashion, but they're also been focusing on business development. And I think when you talk about sister-to-sister relationships, these are very basic themes that come across any two cities. And there's been some official visits as well.
Sure.
Montreal, I don't know if your listeners know much about it. It's our second largest city. It's, of course, our largest predominantly French-speaking city.
Right.
And it's the center of the aviation industry in Canada, for example. It's the home of the International Civil Aviation Authority. So it has that pedigree as a global city with particular strengths in aviation, among other things, pharmaceuticals, and even the gaming industry. So Busan hosts G-Star here, for example, every year. And that's always an event that Canadian companies like to participate in. So I think there's a lot of different connections on the business and on the cultural side between the two cities, and we're very happy to support them. And we do have a Quebec office here in Korea, and they've asked me to remind the listeners that they'll be celebrating their 30th anniversary of their presence in Korea this year. So I think that's maybe deserves some special recognition.
Yeah, congratulations on that as well. Round of applause, yeah.
Right. Also, this year marks the 6th anniversary of the Honorary Consulate of Canada to Korea in Busan. So tell us about the work the consulate carries out.
Well, the consular office here is for the Canadian residents. As I mentioned, I think about 2,000 living in Busan and Gyeongsang-namdo. And the consulate, that's their main work, is to help the embassy deliver consular services to Canadians living here. And those consular services are hopefully very mundane ones, like renewing passports or notification of documents, that kind of thing. They also have, of course, a role in an emergency, but let's not anticipate.
It doesn't, hopefully those services aren't used too much.
Yeah, it's like you prepare for the worst and hope for the best, which is, I guess, the motto of governments everywhere. But apart from that consular role, which I would suggest is their most important, they also play a role in assisting with embassy activities here in Busan. So, for example, when we're involved in a trade fair or we're involved in some kind of cultural, we've in the past been very frequent participants in Busan International Film Festival. They'll help us with some advice and with some logistics, things like that. So we're very happy with the work that the consulate's been doing.
All right. Well, congratulations on 6th anniversary. Here's to 60 more.
Yeah.
Right? All right. That's going to do it for me and Stephanie's conversation with the ambassador, Canadian ambassador to Korea, Mr. Michael Danagher. We're actually going to step out for a bit, but Mr. Danagher, you're going to continue your talk with actually Canadian residents residing here in our city of Busan. So we're going to get a chance to see what their life is all about here in our city. We thank you so much for this time, just being able to sit down with us and share, what you've been doing as well as your time here in Busan and Korea. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both.